Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Public Affairs in Practice podcast. I've been really fortunate now to talk to a number of professionals from public affairs that have different roles. And it's always nice to get a sort of different perspective on what we do and how we do it. And that's why I'm particularly pleased this time to welcome Matt Day from Adobe to the podcast. Now, I'm now going to butcher Matt's CV, so I'll get him to put me right in a minute when if I get anything wrong. But Matt started his career working in Parliament before joining a public affairs consultancy. Went from there to PayPal, big name that we all know. Then back into consultancy with FTI Consulting, and then back into another in-house role. So a bit of a back and forward between the two, where he is now. And I think you've been there for about a year at Adobe as head of policy and government relations. Have I sort of captured the CV appropriately?
That's right. Yeah, I did a secondment on PayPal whilst I was at FTI. They were a client, and we had they didn't have anyone in the UK for a while, so I stepped into the role. But I also kept going at FTI at the same time, so we kind of split the week across. So it was a bit of a strange relationship, but it was good.
It's quite complicated as well, I would imagine, trying to keep 2 email addresses going and things like that.
And 2 laptops and 2 phones and everything else, yeah.
Hey, well, look, I thought we'd start by, if you could just, Matt, give us an idea about sort of how you got into public affairs, and was it always something you wanted to do, some little inkling that was always in your head?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think I never knew that public affairs existed as an industry. So I didn't know anybody that worked in it. And I didn't kind of have people that kind of worked in associated industries as well. So I always knew I wanted to work in politics when I was like 17, 18, really interested in politics. And so I knew I wanted to work around that. But I thought really the only prism to do that was to work in Parliament, either for an MP or obviously like become one eventually in the future. And then I watched House of Cards one day, and Remy Danton, the lobbyist in that, kind of burst onto the scene. I thought, that's quite an interesting job. You kind of, you're amongst the halls of power, but you don't have the same responsibility that parliamentarians do. And so I thought, that's quite good. And then when I worked in Parliament, obviously you get exposed to lobbyists because they're contacting the member that you work for, trying to get them to do X, Y, and Z. And I think it kind of just led to that. I think there's a little bit of a merry-go-round of, I always say to people, of like working in Parliament, consultancy, NGOs, think tanks. And I think most people kind of travel around the merry-go-round throughout their careers. And so I just wanted to step into that after being in Parliament.
And how did you find that the sort of parliamentary role sort of prepared you for that life of public affairs? And by the way, I'm a bit of a House of Cards fan. Probably all people in public affairs are House of Cards fan, but I only sort of wish our life was quite as glamorous as maybe made out to be in the programme. Maybe you were a bit disappointed when you actually got to work in it. But yeah, what that bit in Parliament, what did that teach you? What did that prepare you for public affairs?
I think it's an excellent training ground. I think if you want to work in anything remotely to do with public affairs or even comms, it's a really good training ground to kind of start your career or to go into at different points, because it's such a demanding job. I mean, that can wildly depend on the member that you actually work for, but I think it teaches you some really good transferable skills. So, the number one that comes to mind is kind of brevity, in terms of, your MP has got like 5 minutes for you to brief them before they have this meeting. And so you need to get down all the really key information. You need to be able to tell them it. And that's the same, like if you go into a new business meeting for a consultancy and you're prepping a senior leader before they do that meeting. So I think that skill comes over a lot. But I think the biggest thing is, being in Parliament teaches you how things actually get done in public affairs versus how everybody kind of thinks they get done. So, it is a person-to-person industry, and so you realise how much lobbying work can get done at the bar near Parliament, or through interpersonal relationships of people that you meet at events, an APPG event or something, a reception that you go to in Parliament. So I think that's what it actually teaches you and preps you for really well, so that you don't kind of have a A-level government and politics understanding of how the process actually works, but you actually know how it really works.
Yeah, that difference between sort of theory and practice, where if you look at the theory, it's, this happens then that moves across and it's in a committee and that's it, as opposed to the actual day-to-day, which is partly relationships, partly just understanding that things don't just work in a very literal sort of process, I always find as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. You can get really stuck on some of that stuff. And I think it teaches you new skills as well about how to be creative. Like when you've worked on the other side and you've seen that member of parliament gets, I don't know, 1,000 emails a day, which is conservative for some of them, and say 250 of those might be from companies, and you sit there and you think, okay, when I worked in Parliament, what made me click on the email, or what did I read and then go, was that worth showing it to the boss? And so I think then when you're on the other side, you can think about that and go, oh yeah, okay, I know how that works.
Yeah, and you raise a good point that the person that works in the MP's office, whether it's the parliamentary office or the constituency office, are the gatekeeper. So as much as you can know and understand the pressures that are on them, and you say that 1,000 emails a day, but also other people just ringing them up as well as we would do. That little bit of empathy, I think, sometimes goes a very long way as well.
Yeah, and also I think actually understanding that the staff are the way through to everything. Because again, I think sometimes when you're outside of the industry, you can kind of think, okay, well, I'll contact the member, I'll appeal to them. But actually, realistically, because all the emails that they're getting and just, the way that they're so managed, because they have to be, because there's so much in their diary, understanding that, okay, well, actually, if you know the staff member for that MP, then they might raise it. If you can make it appeal to them, that's how, again, going back to my earlier point, like that's how it actually works versus going to the member directly.
And do you find, Adobe, you're a big global brand, you operate probably in lots and lots of countries. I'm sure you've got the facts and figures, at your fingertips. Do you find that helps in terms of the engagement as well? Or does it not work like that? Does it even put up some barriers sometimes, maybe in the minds of some MPs? Because you're a big, if I'm right in thinking, US originally, probably still US based, global brand, tech. Does that bring some challenges rather than being a sort of an opening of the doors?
Well, I think finding a way to get your email opened or your call answered by a minister or a member of parliament is the continuous challenge for people in our industry. And I think that challenge exists no matter which company or charity or whatever you work for. I think over the years, particularly when I was at FTI, and I worked with everything from kind of really big companies to charities and then, through to Adobe now, I think it can depend largely on what you actually have to say. I think that's overwhelmingly important, right? The message. It is definitely true that bigger companies in general find it a little bit easier to open doors because typically maybe they employ more people in the UK or they represent a bigger share of the kind of economic output. And so obviously they're going to have more to say, or there might be a special project that they're investing in, etc. But I think it largely depends on your issue and what you actually want to talk to them about. Because I think a lot of the mistakes I see sometimes in the industry is that people just want to get in touch with policymakers, tell them how good they are, like what a great company they are, all the really good things that they're doing. But, they don't want to talk about that. Like MPs want to hear, like, what can I do to actually help? And so if you come to them and say, look, we've got this really important campaign that we need your support with, or there's this issue in a piece of legislation that's going to deter millions of pounds worth of investment into the UK, then all of a sudden you find it's a lot easier to open doors and have that conversation. That's not always true. Because sometimes, there's a political issue of the day on, or you're right, sometimes they don't like that company for whatever reason, or they're a bit wary, periods where the industry has gone through kind of various scandals can make policymakers, I found, like a bit wary in general of engaging with any company for a while. And that kind of goes in peaks and troughs. But yeah, I think it's largely dependent on the issue. Like Adobe, because we are such a large company that represents the creative sector, we've got all our big creative software tools. So when we speak on something like the copyright and AI debate, and we have a really unique perspective on it because we have an AI model, but we also have all the creatives on the other side, then we're finding that people really want to hear what we have to say because we have a unique perspective on the issue.
I think, yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think you've put your finger on sort of 2 points. One is around reputation. And very often a reputation is sometimes because organisations themselves haven't communicated very well or just sort of assumed that audiences, particularly MPs, know and understand them. And that isn't always the case because they've got so many other things to think about. But also that you have to have something different to say. You have to, there has to be a point of differentiation from you. So even if you are a big global, company, there are other big global companies that are out there that probably do, maybe not as good as Adobe's creative solutions, but they'll be out there as well. So almost whatever size you are, whatever sector it is you are, it is still a competitive space, and you still have to get those messages right, really understand what it is you're trying to say, and frankly, why anybody should bother to listen to you.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I've seen people who run really small public affairs teams, or they work for kind of charities that maybe aren't even that large, or companies that aren't even that large, but they have an outsized influence comparative to that in terms of their ability to get meetings with ministers or to get political attention. And so, again, because maybe they have something really interesting to say, maybe they've developed a piece of technology which is really interesting, or they're campaigning about a charitable issue which is really important and it's fresh and it's new. But also, I think, you can't understate the importance of personal relationships as well. You might work for a small company, but if you are incredibly well networked across the political spectrum, then that still opens a lot of doors. I mean, you have to have the right message, but again, if you are sending a cold email, your chances of success kind of diminish a little bit.
Yeah, the groundwork first of all. Yeah, no, I'd agree with that entirely. And being part of a sort of a global business, are there particular challenges that you face in terms of sort of making sure that other bits of the business, maybe other communications functions or marketing teams or whatever, are sort of consistent with what you want to do in terms of government relations and political engagement? Do you have a sort of a rod of iron which you can sort of wave? I'm not sure if that's quite a right analogy, really. Anyway, but you know what I mean. To make sure that everybody is sort of helping you rather than government affairs sort of fighting against other bits of the business.
I think every head of government relations or head of comms wishes they had that iron rod to kind of bring legal, marketing, and others into shape. I don't think it quite works like that.
Sadly.
I think it's a kind of continuous challenge that people working in comms and public affairs often have, which is to really take a step back and recognise that government relations might be your job, but it is nobody else's day job. And so everybody is working on a million different things, whether that's the marketing team, legal team. And so they all have other priorities as well. So you have to be super flexible. When you're doing government relations thing, but you want to partner with comms, then you have to be flexible to kind of work with them on their timelines. But I think you also have to be, particularly when you're in-house, you almost have to treat the business as a client the same way that you would in a consultancy. Like, you're there to advise them, you're there to kind of project manage effectively, sometimes lots of different teams together. And I think when it comes to an Adobe perspective, I've certainly found that collaboration is something that's really big as a cultural value here. And our CEO has this whole idea that good ideas come from anywhere and really encourages teams to work together. So that's great. Like, we work really well with the comms team and the legal team to get stuff done. And I think, we always say, look, these are the core messages. Like, we work those out together, whether they're going out to a journalist or an MP or what have you. And this is our position on something, so that we can stay aligned and make sure we don't say something in two different markets that's different. Always good to avoid. I think, but this is also really important when you're dealing with senior leaders, because I think, again, the challenge I see a lot in the industry is that sometimes public affairs people don't realise that CEOs might not have any understanding of the political situation. Like, they've got so many other things on their mind. They've just had a meeting with a CFO about the numbers, or a big investor, or whatever else. And so I think you always have to think, okay, what is the really important thing I need to make them aware of? Like, if there's a policy update in the market, I need to keep them aware of so that they know. But that's a continuous challenge that I think everybody in the industry faces.
And do you have particular ways or particular triggers in your own mind that, if that big issue does come through, you sort of recognise that that's, maybe it's down to relationships, but you recognise that that's important enough to absolutely raise with them, whereas the normal day-to-day you keep to one side? Do you have any sort of, ways that you work out what they are?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we have a policy at Adobe of kind of over communication. So we think it's generally just better to kind of make people aware of things now, and like, no surprises is generally the policy. But I think you have to make a judgment call of, okay, if it's something was said in a debate that's realistically maybe not going to go anywhere, versus, you kind of hear on the grapevine that this thing that you may or may not like is coming in consultation. And so, you have to escalate it up. I think in general, it's always good to make people aware ahead of the event. And then if it doesn't turn into anything and there was kind of no panic required, then that's almost better than just sending an email like, this has suddenly gone wrong, this is in the wrong direction, we suddenly need to do loads of stuff on it.
Yeah. So based on your understanding, your knowledge of the people and politics generally as well, I guess. And that's I mean, I suppose an interesting point, which is that, particularly here in the UK at the moment, although, further afield as well. I mean, but here in the UK, despite having a government with a, Labour government with a huge majority, if the polls are to be believed, and we'll see how they pan out in local elections and, national elections in Scotland and Wales and obviously the next general election. But if they're to be believed at the moment, we're, even with that large majority for Labour government, we seem to be moving into a period where other parties, what were formerly smaller parties, and funny enough, former large parties have become smaller, sort of more of a multi-politics, multi-party process. How do you navigate that particular conundrum?
Well, that's going to be really interesting over the next few years to try and figure that out. I think, the polls, as you said, are incredibly tight. I think I saw one today that maybe Reform are in the lead, or they're kind of, they're all broadly tied. But actually, someone pointed out to me the other day that the Brexit Party were second or tied first in June 2019. And then obviously, 5 months later, Boris won a huge majority. So I think the idea that anybody knows what the polls will look like in 4.5 years' time when we have another election. So we all have to figure that out. And I think from a public affairs perspective, it makes you think about things from a long-term perspective when it comes to engagement. Firstly, because you don't know how the political sands will shift, particularly when the polls are really tight. So which party might win the next election, which party might become more important or win more seats. But I think this is also true with kind of individual politicians. It's become harder to read the tea leaves about maybe who's a runner and a rider. And so that MP that you may, on the face of it, think maybe I'll prioritise engaging with someone else, they could be Secretary of State in a year or two, or they could be a really important minister, or they could look after a committee that you think is really important. But I think also, particularly when politics get tighter and more multi-party, we have to think that everybody in the political system can add value. So just because someone is a backbencher or an opposition party, well, that doesn't mean that they can't submit an amendment to a piece of legislation which is favourable to what you want, or they can't host an event in Parliament or raise some issue that you're interested in. And I think the other thing that's really important is to just keep your political biases completely out of it. And I think generally most people in the industry do a really good job of that. But, what you believe personally is just unimportant. But, inherently, if you work in this industry, you have political opinions. Many of us have worked for MPs or political parties, but just continuing to do a really good job of putting that to one side in terms of how you prioritise engagement, but also having kind of clarity of thought in the way that you analyse issues in terms of the outcome of the next election, or who's likely to respond in what way to something politically, and just, taking a step back.
I think that's good advice. And for your own career, Matt, as you've gone through consultancy and in-house, have you received any particular good bits of advice? Maybe it's about keeping one's own politics out, or the ways to do that. But any particularly good bits of advice that you've received that have informed your approach in these different roles?
Yeah, so one thing I've been really lucky with in my career is to have really good mentors at different points. I've been super fortunate with that, which is also great because I didn't know anybody that worked in the space when I first got into it. So I've been really lucky to work with some really good people. But thinking about this question, there's three things that really stood out to me of advice I've been given. So one is my sixth form law teacher. So when I did law in sixth form, we often used to debate politics because we talk about current affairs and issues. And it used to get very heated. We were all 18-year-olds who thought we understood how the world worked and how politics worked. And, this was kind of a time when politics was quite fractious. And she told me, I was very ideological about politics, as you are as an 18-year-old. And she told me once that nobody has ever been convinced by someone else by being called stupid. And it sounds like a really simplistic piece of advice. But actually, you see this in political discourse all the time. You see politicians kind of saying voters are stupid because they think a certain way about a different issue. And you see it in public affairs as well. Like particularly corporate leaders, might say something about a politician. I don't understand why they don't get that. And so actually that has stuck with me for years, that actually you have to walk people through something, even if you think you can't comprehend how they have a position that's different to yours. You're not going to get there by shouting at them. You have to walk them through the logic. You're not always going to change their mind, but thinking about it in that way of a process has helped me a lot in life in general. The second thing is understanding that what we do in public affairs and government relations is really important, but it has to be connected to the business. And so this was something that Stephen Day, my boss at FTI, told me, is basically like, it's great if we get these policy wins for a company on a given thing, but the CEO isn't really thinking in that terms of getting the policy wins. What they are thinking about is how can we make that operating environment in that country more favorable to this company? How can we make it so that this initiative that we've just launched gets the backing of the government, or we're able to do that thing in the society? So I think sometimes you see in public affairs, people kind of get lost in their vacuum and their silo of like getting policy wins. But understanding that actually you do just fit into that bigger business, and you need to make the bottom line get healthier the same way that everyone else at the company does. And then the other thing that stuck out with me is just the importance of brevity. So when I worked in Parliament, I thought I was really good at this, making sure that things were not 2 pages, but 1 pages. And then I started working in consultancy for a really great guy called Mitchell Cohen, and he'd worked for the banks in 2008. And he was just like, this 1-page report I do for guys, it's too long. What are the 3 bullets that you need to know? And in the first kind of few months of working together, he constantly used to edit my work, make it shorter. Let's focus on that 1 thing, 2 things. And actually that was really important, because now I think about that now and try not to, he would never read anything if it was more than 2 pages. So now I try to make sure that nothing I write is kind of more than 1.
That's tough. That's really tough. Good advice, but really tough to actually boil things down, because sometimes it's all you can do to get it down to 2 sides, let alone 1, let alone 3 bullets, when you're trying to convey quite complex subjects, I guess, a lot of the time.
Yeah, I think it is, but you also realize that there is so much fluff in the way that we all write, but even sometimes the way that we explain things as well. I think what was great was seeing him on client calls, and a lot of the times you get on and someone will sit there and kind of pontificate for 10 minutes about the political environment in the UK and kind of why it's important for that business. He would get on a call and he'd basically be like, right, okay, look, this is what it is. This piece of legislation is here. This is how it's going to affect the business, and just speak extremely plainly. And I think a lot of the times, that's not always right for all clients and all sectors. Like some like to have a bit more of a chat and get into the weeds, but particularly if you work with things like the financial services industry or tech, they just want to get into it. They want to know how it's relevant and then move on, next issue.
I think you're right. Well, he's right, you're right, and especially for senior leaders, unless that you happen to get them at a good time or over a cup of coffee or something like that. The idea that they've got, 10 minutes to chat about, Parliament and machinations of government departments or whatever is for the birds, isn't it? It's got to be short and pithy and absolutely to the point. And I think sometimes, again, you having worked in consultancy and in-house, I don't know if you'd agree with this, but sometimes for the consultancy, sometimes, not so much in briefing papers maybe, but maybe more in the verbal side of things, there can be a sort of let's just make this a little bit longer than we otherwise might need to, in some way, because we're using it as a way of showing our value to a client. So instead of keeping it short and sharp and maybe thinking about them, we think about ourselves a little bit too much and become a bit too chatty, so that we can prove our that monthly retainer.
Yeah, you absolutely see that, and I think virtually everyone that's worked in consultancy is guilty of that at one time or another. And there's definitely a time and place for that, and when you want to show expertise in the market. But I think it's something you probably have to figure out with your individual client, right, about how much they just want to get to the point. I'm a big believer in that, documents should be short, and we should just kind of get to what we want to discuss. But as I said, there are other clients that they want to talk and kind of chat through. But I think you have to remember that very rarely, particularly with senior leaders, a good point you raised, they're not as interested in politics as you are. And in general, if you're an in-house person and you're on the consultancy side talking to, they have got so much more to think about. Like, I never appreciated until I stepped in-house how much you have to think about in-house, how many other loops you have to think about to go through. If you want to do anything, you've got to get sign off from various teams and you've got to go through all the processes. I used to get frustrated sometimes on the consultancy side because you come up with this great idea and you say it to the client and then the client will go, yeah, okay. And then it'd be 3 weeks, you wouldn't hear anything. They haven't done it. The moment's passed and you go, oh man, why did they not do that thing? And then you step into the shoes and you go, oh yeah, okay, now I understand why they didn't do that thing.
Yeah, processes, people, internal sign-off, etc. Yeah, needed for very good reasons very often, especially again in bigger organisations. But yeah, incredibly frustrating as well. And as we come towards the end, Matt, I'd just like to ask you what your thoughts are on the use of AI in public affairs and the future of public affairs. Not least because obviously Adobe are huge in the creative space, and I know that you do a lot of AI tools as part of your products as well, and that's obviously increasing. So, anything that you've seen, sort of internally or externally, that you think gives you some picture of the way that public affairs might develop?
I mean, it's a bit of a cliche point, but I definitely think that public affairs will be affected by AI the same way that literally every industry is being affected by AI. And, we're already beginning to see that. So I think one thing that comes to mind is the research aspect. So we all know that when you're at a junior level in public affairs or comms, you have to do a lot of grunt work and that involves a lot of research. And so that might be something like a new business briefing where the boss says, go away, find me the 5 issues that company's dealt with recently, tell me their financials, their key people. And so you'd go away for a day or two, you come back and then you give them that report. But ChatGPT allows you to do that in 20 minutes, whereas before you'd have to think about it for a day or two. So I think it will continue to be really important, like it will be in a lot of industries, to kind of keep pace with the tools, understand how to use them so that you are as productive as you possibly can be, and certainly as productive as peers who might be using some of those tools. But the second thing I think is that the interpersonal skills that exist in the industry will become even more important than they already are. So, an AI tool might be able to write an outreach email to a member of parliament, but they don't know that member of parliament. As we talked about earlier, personal relationships are incredibly important in the space, as they kind of always have been. And so I think that will continue to be really important, your personal network, that you have your ability to go out and meet people in the space, and also to fundamentally get on a call with a client and be able to assure them through whatever it is you're talking to them about. But also from a gut, kind of a gut feel perspective, I think that's a real strong skill that lots of senior people in the industry have. They've got the experience, they've been through this situation before, they know how to play it, they know what word in a press release might be inflammatory, and who's going to be the first company that's bold enough to let ChatGPT write their crisis comms press release and stick that out without having a human in the loop, right? So I don't see that happening. But the last thing I say as well is I think it will help us in public affairs be a little bit more creative. So I think, there's been a bit of an explosion in the last couple of years of people being able to use things like text to image, generative AI, and Adobe has a tool like that called Firefly. We also have a text to video model that we've just released in the UK as well. So I think because these things make it inherently more easy to be creative, you don't have to be an expert about how a piece of software works. You can just type in a prompt and then all of a sudden this super creative thing comes up and it's super easy to use. That will mean that people in public affairs can offer more creative campaigns to clients. If you're in-house, you can more easily work with other teams rather to push some of this great work out. So I think we'll certainly see a lot more of that in the years to come. And I'm quite excited for what we can do. I'm sure that there are AI tools being developed right now that even I don't know about, that will make doing public affairs maybe even easier.
No, that sounds fascinating. And I think, again, I look at these tools and you do think, yeah, that could be used in X, Y, Z sort of way. But the level of simplicity of use it seems to be the real game changer, doesn't it? It's the fact that, basically if somebody like me can, work out how to use the sort of tools you're talking about, then frankly, anybody can. And once that is the case, then, it still keeps us, I think, at that sort of human interaction, part. That's still really important, but opens up these other opportunities, which open up, again, the opportunities for that engagement, at the same time. So I think that's hopefully it's a good point to end it on that. I mean, because I think you've given a good a nice sort of upbeat ending to today's chat. So look, thank you very much for your time. It's hugely appreciated, and I know those listening to the podcast will, I think, find the chat we've had today fascinating, because we've touched on so many different points. But to have your experience both in-house and consultancy, and particularly some of those new technologies as well. So brilliant. Thank you very much for your time.
Great. Thanks for having me on, Stuart.